Hi, welcome to Once Upon a Political Time. I'm Carly, and I am so excited about our show today, because today we are talking about something that has fascinated me for many years: the mortgage giants, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And fun fact, you literally have to call them the mortgage giants, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
Mortgage giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
For mortgage giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
Mortgage giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
Mortgage giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
Troubled mortgage giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac.
But though we all say mortgage giants, really, Fannie and Freddie are more like mortgage vampires. Let me break this down for you. First, vampires prefer to live in dark, overcast places because sunlight hurts them. As one source notes, being in the sunlight too long will cause a vampire to feel ill. Similarly, Fannie and Freddie have long preferred to live out of the spotlight, as too much attention seems to make them feel a little ill as well. Second, vampires live off of the blood of humans and other animals. Fannie and Freddie live off of the housing market, the lifeblood of the American economy. Third, vampires tend to be stronger and more powerful than humans, and they heal more quickly from injury. Well, as we shall see, Fannie and Freddie aren't your average Fortune 500 companies. Stronger? Check. More powerful? Check. Heal faster? Check. And finally, and most importantly, Fannie and Freddie, like vampires, have long lived in a space between. While vampires are not quite living and not quite dead, Fannie and Freddie are not quite public companies and not quite private companies. They are GSEs, government-sponsored enterprises. And, depending on who you ask, they resemble the vampires of folklore, menacing monsters, viciously bloodthirsty, or they're more akin to the Cullens, the much-beloved vampiric family from the Twilight series, who shunned their murderous kinfolk and refused to feast on the human race.
My family, we're different from others of our kind. We only hunt animals. We learn to control our thirst.
We learn to control our thirst. And now I'm chronically dehydrated. It's really quite debilitating, actually. Monster headaches all the time. No matter how much I moisturize, I never feel dewy. It's a nightmare, really. Here's what I love about Fannie and Freddie. For something that might, in another world, be one of the driest aspects of public policy, the mortgage market, Fannie and Freddie inspire remarkably wild passions. As one politician put it, quote, Fannie has this grandmotherly image, but they will castrate you, decapitate you, tie you up, and throw you in the Potomac. And Fannie and Freddie continue to inspire wild passions and controversy, most recently in a lawsuit brought by a group of investors against the United States government over the way the government has handled the GSEs since 2008. But that's the story for our next show. Today we're going to talk about the history of Fannie and Freddie, and to try to answer the age-old question, Fannie and Freddie, friend or foe? Vicious bloodsuckers or the Cullen family? To help me in this, I spoke with Bethany McLean, journalist and author of the book Shaky Ground, The Strange Saga of the U.S. Mortgage Giants, and Sten van Nieuwerburgh, David S. Loeb Professor of Finance and the Director of the Center of Real Estate Finance at NYU's Stern School of Business, as well as the author of Guaranteed to Fail, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the Debacle of Mortgage Finance. So let's start at the very beginning. Fannie Mae was born in 1938. Freddie wouldn't be born for another couple of decades, which, fun fact, means that Fannie and Freddie, despite being over 30 years apart, are actually closer in age than some of Mick Jagger's children. This is Karis Jagger, she's 47, and this is her half-brother Devereaux, and he's not yet a year old, so there are no pictures of him. The point is, one of Mick Jagger's children is old enough to be the grandmother of another of Mick Jagger's children. But I digress. Once upon a political time, Fannie wasn't a vampire. At first, she was just your regular old run-of-the-mill Great Depression-inspired government initiative. The creation of Fannie was one part of a concerted effort by the United States government to help more people become homeowners in the wake of the Great Depression. It worked like this. A bank gave Mr. Smith a loan to buy a house. Then Fannie Mae would step in and guarantee Mr. Smith's loan, either by buying the loan outright from the bank or by simply promising to pay the bank if Mr. Smith didn't. Get it? Basically, Fannie Mae's job was to protect banks from the risk that a homeowner like Mr. Smith would stop paying his mortgage. In return, the bank would pay Fannie a guarantee fee, a sum of money for the insurance Fannie was providing. This incentivized banks to lend to more people because it meant they weren't taking the risk on themselves, and that meant that more people ultimately got homes, and so more people were homeowners. More white people got homes. In discussing the history of Fannie and Freddie, it's important to note that when Fannie Mae came about in 1938, she would not guarantee mortgage loans made to African Americans. The consequences of this have been lasting and far-reaching. Honestly, I'm thinking of doing an entire show just on that because it's been a pretty big deal. For now, suffice it to say that, among other things, this racist policy meant that houses were much more expensive for African Americans than for white folks, as housing for blacks was not subsidized by the United States government. That aside, FDR, who was president at the time, had hoped that private companies and private capital would fill Fannie's role, that private companies would buy up mortgage debt from the banks. But alas, no dice. Or should I say, no house. It's been a long week. No private investor wanted to enter the mortgage market in the wake of the Depression. So that's when the government stepped in and created the Federal National Mortgage Association, FNMA, though everyone just called her Fannie Mae. Fannie, in many ways, is what jump-started the housing market after the Great Depression and spurred the boom in middle-class home ownership in the middle of the 20th century. This is the grandmother Fannie Mae that I mentioned at the top, the kindly maternal figure helping you afford your mortgage, certainly more a Cullen than a vicious vampire. And Fannie was able to help so many members of the white working class and middle classes become homeowners through one important tool, the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. The 30-year fixed-rate mortgage is an unbelievable staple of American life. Here's a Quicken Loans advertisement to explain some of the benefits of the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, with accompanying background music, courtesy of what I can only imagine was a Fruit Loop playing a xylophone.
The 30-year fixed mortgage has been America's #1 home loan choice for more than 60 years. There are a few good reasons why, starting with the fact that it offers a low payment and allows you to finance the home of your dreams at an interest rate that never changes.
I love picturing a Fruit Loop playing a xylophone. It'd be so cute. Anyways, Quicken Loans is right. The 30-year fixed-rate mortgage is a dream for many consumers for all the reasons mentioned in the video. Those are also the same reasons, however, that it's a total nightmare for lenders. It is only because the U.S. government is involved in the housing market through Fannie and Freddie that United States lenders are able to offer a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. We are one of just 2 countries in the world to offer this. It's us and Denmark. This is important because, for all their other flaws, which we'll discuss, Fannie and Freddie have been the backbone of the American dream of homeownership. They have been hugely instrumental in creating a middle class of homeowners. It's like Cinderella taught us. If you keep on believing, the dreams that you wish will lead to the advent of a revolutionary mortgage system and unprecedented expansion of affordable homeownership, which in turn will spur a boost in the nation's middle class. But this fairy tale has yet to reach its happily ever after. In 1968, the federal government decided to essentially spin off Fannie Mae from the government and make her a private company with a CEO, a board of directors, shareholders, the whole 9 yards. They did this because the Johnson administration was worried about the rising national deficit and didn't want to have to put Fannie's debts on the national balance sheet. So, Fannie became what in some ways FDR had always wanted her to be, a private company. But see, Fannie wasn't a normal private company. As one NPR reporter put it, quote, by privatizing Fannie Mae, Johnson, he was president at the time, ushered into existence perhaps the strangest hybrid entity in the annals of American finance. Put another way, Fannie Mae became a vampire. Because Fannie had this clearly public mission to facilitate and increase homeownership, Fannie Mae got special treatment, often called her charter benefits or her subsidy. Now, these benefits fell into 2 general categories. One category of benefits helped to lure in investors by lowering the costs and therefore increasing the attractiveness of the mortgages Fannie guaranteed. It made Fannie's products more inviting.
Everything about me invites you in. My voice, my face, even my smell.
Everything about me invites you in. Well, except the freeze-dried vanilla ice cream I call my skin. I'm so dehydrated. The second set of benefits given to Fannie created the appearance of a special relationship between Fannie and the government. These ultimately led people to believe that Fannie and Freddie had the backing of the United States government, which is to say that people believed that if things went south, the U.S. government would step in to save Fannie and Freddie and their investors. This, of course, made Fannie and Freddie seem like super safe investments, because I mean, she was backed by the full faith and credit of the US government. This set of benefits made Fannie stronger than other companies, more powerful.
As if you could outrun me! As if you could fight me off. I'm designed to kill.
If I may say, this is how women end up in bad relationships. He is supposed to be a sex symbol. It's important to note that when it came to the GSEs, nobody of importance was publicly saying that the government was backing Fannie and Freddie. In fact, Fannie, Freddie, and the US government were publicly saying the opposite. But no matter what anyone said out loud, there was always this sense, fostered in secret, of, the government won't let Fannie and Freddie fail. This was known as the implicit government guarantee. Here's Bethany McLean.
The implicit guarantee is one of the stranger things in finance or in the world. I mean, the more you think about the fact that we talk about an implicit guarantee that isn't explicit, right. It's an insane concept. This thing that doesn't exist, that's not supposed to exist, that still has a name, right. And that everybody discusses anyway. And the idea that this is in the world of supposedly rational capitalism, that we have this thing called an implicit guarantee. It's crazy.
It's crazy, because everything about Fannie and Freddie is crazy. Bethany said it. This thing that doesn't exist, that's not supposed to exist, that still has a name. Is it just me, or is Fannie Mae the Illuminati? Anyway, Fannie and Freddie did everything they could to foster, in private, this sense that the government was behind them, even while publicly denying it. Bethany again.
Yeah, well, and Fannie and Freddie and the government both really privately fostered the idea that there was this implicit guarantee, correct? Even while publicly totally denouncing it.
I don't know how much the government did. Fannie and Freddie certainly did. When they would go on road trips overseas, they wouldn't call themselves Fannie and Freddie. They would call themselves the Federal National Mortgage Corporation.
Oh, yeah.
Just to reinforce this idea.
It's sort of like if everyone called you Gus. You would still walk into important business meetings and introduce yourself as Gustav. Because really, who's going to be taken more seriously? Gus or Gustav? But this implicit guarantee, and all Fannie and Freddie's charter benefits for that matter, have long stirred up controversy and resentment. Fannie's critics argue that for all their talk of helping homeownership, all Fannie and Freddie really did was to use their subsidy to become monstrously profitable and then pass those profits along to their executives and shareholders. Essentially, they say the already rich CEOs and investors were getting a payday at the hands of the taxpayers. Of course, Fannie and Freddie argue that their charter benefits were essential for helping them get access to the private capital that they needed to effectively follow their public mission of facilitating homeownership. We'll come back to this debate. First, let's turn to the 1980s, the years the financial world changed because of one man, Louis Ranieri.
That is until Louis Ranieri came on the scene at Salomon Brothers.
You might not know who he is, but he changed your life more than Michael Jordan, the iPod, and YouTube put together.
He's like what would happen if Chipotle guacamole made love to all of Shonda Rhimes' television shows. He's like if the musical Hamilton and pumpkin spice lattes had a baby named Fidget Spinner. Louis Ranieri created the first mortgage-backed security, and for the first time since the early 1900s, private companies were interested in buying mortgages.
Louis didn't know it yet, but he'd already changed banking forever with one simple idea.
The mortgage-backed security, or private label MBS. You've got your average person's mortgage, fixed rate, 30 years, boring, safe, small payoff, right? But when you have thousands of them all bundled together, suddenly the yield goes up, but the risk is still small because, well, they're mortgages. And who the hell doesn't pay their mortgage?
What exactly is the credit rating on this bond?
This bond, gentlemen, is AAA rated.
This is exactly what the Michigan State Pension Fund has been looking for. I'll buy $20 million.
Oh, come on, live a little.
$25 million.
The money came raining.
Live a little off of other people's money. This meant a crossroads for Fannie and Freddie. Listen to Bethany McLean talk about that here.
Right. Well, so it was a really interesting moment in time because Wall Street came up with this way to securitize mortgages, meaning that Wall Street firms would turn them into securities, would buy up mortgages and use the credit rating agencies in order to create the AAA super safe rated securities that investors wanted and sell them on. And that could have squeezed out Fannie and Freddie if they weren't allowed to participate in this new game of securitization.
That's right. In theory, Fannie and Freddie could have been done because mortgages had finally been turned into something that, in some ways, FDR had always wanted them to be, an appealing investment for private capital. But, of course, Fannie and Freddie weren't done because, well, they're Fannie and Freddie. They're vampires, stronger and more powerful than other humans/companies, remember? They will castrate you, decapitate you, tie you up, and throw you in the Potomac. Here's Bethany again.
They would have been done. But Fannie did some last minute closed door dagger bearing negotiating, and they were allowed to participate in this new market. And so you ended up with this sort of uncomfortable dynamic where Fannie and Freddie and Wall Street were basically sharing the securitization market.
And who could be better sharers than vampires and hedge funds? I feel like this is going to end really well. For much of the 1990s, this dynamic wasn't so much one of sharing, but rather of Wall Street renting a little space in Fannie and Freddie's market. The combination of Fannie and Freddie's charter benefits, which made their mortgages more appealing to investors, their aggressive lobbying, and their showy do-gooding, made it so that Fannie and Freddie dominated the mortgage industry in the 1990s. Now, if you're wondering about this showy do-gooding, well, let me explain. In 1992, Congress passed a bill that implemented something called the Affordable Housing Lending Standards on Fannie and Freddie. This meant that a certain percentage of Fannie and Freddie's businesses had to go to helping low-income families and to those buying real estate in less desirable neighborhoods. It was Congress's response to the concern that the GSE's profits were simply being passed on to its executives and shareholders. Fannie and Freddie, in turn, used these standards and the idea that they were essential and that Fannie and Freddie were essential to providing homes for millions of middle-class and lower-middle-class families to build a base of support for themselves. It was said that if an elected official so much as thought a bad thought about Fannie or Freddie in the 1990s, you would hear the fax machine going off, meaning the GSE's grassroots networks would start mobilizing to de-seat you in the next election. They will castrate you, decapitate you, tie you up, and throw you in the Potomac. And as their political operation rolled on, their balance sheets boomed as well. Fannie and Freddie's businesses had expanded from the early days. No longer were Fannie and Freddie simply mortgage guarantors. They were active participants in the mortgage-backed security trading economy that had been ushered in by Louis Ranieri. Fannie and Freddie started buying mortgages and mortgage-backed securities from Wall Street and holding them on their books as a way to boost their own profits, just like they were any other hedge fund or investor buying MBSs from Wall Street. In fact, Fannie and Freddie, and this is crazy, started buying something called non-conforming loans, thusly named precisely because they didn't conform to the standards that Fannie and Freddie, the guarantors, were supposed to follow. But though they were too low quality for Fannie and Freddie, the guarantors, they were just fine, apparently, for Fannie and Freddie, the investors. Listen to Sten explain this to me.
It sounded like in the book you guys talked about Fannie and Freddie buying non-conforming loans.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought the whole reason they were called non-conforming is because they didn't conform to the standards of
So there's two different things. Right. So there's two things, right? So Fannie and Freddie play these two roles, their guarantee function and their investment function.
Oh, so on the investment
and
side,
so it was
they would
on the
buy
investment side that they were buying non-conforming.
Oh my God, that's insane.
Yes. So they were not guaranteeing that part because you're right, they can't, but they were holding it on their books.
That's interesting.
So I think of Fannie and Freddie as like, at least in the past, they were like a huge hedge fund plus a guarantee function.
Wow.
And their balance sheet was this kind of hedge fund business, and they were doing all kinds of crazy things.
Fannie and Freddie? Crazy things? You don't say. Anyway, this all started to come to a head in the 1990s and early 2000s. Fannie's massive political and financial maneuvering had brought them something they didn't want: sunlight. Lots and lots of sunlight.
This is why we don't show ourselves in sunlight. People would know we're different. This is what I am.
Thirsty. So freaking thirsty. Scrutiny and criticism of Fannie and Freddie exploded starting in the late 1990s. People were angry about their implicit guarantee, about the fact that Fannie and Freddie continued to privately insist it existed, which had allowed their profits to blossom to obscene proportions. People were angry about the risks Fannie and Freddie had been taking, especially in that portfolio business of theirs, which had grown to nearly $800 billion. People were mad from an ideological standpoint. Why did we need government in our mortgage market at all? Frankly, the hatred toward Fannie and Freddie in D.C. became nearly universal and pathological in the early 2000s. Former Fannie CFO Tim Howard would later say that this was a result of a smear campaign launched by Fannie's ideological opponents and market competitors. There may be some truth to this, however, it is also abundantly clear that Fannie brought plenty of bad press on itself. Of course, in 2008, it all blew up. Though the government bailed out the big banks, they took Fannie and Freddie into conservatorship. This is the story for our next episode. For now, however, I want to give my own hot ranting take on the seminal question: Fannie and Freddie, vicious bloodsuckers or Cullen family? Here it goes. Fannie and Freddie used their charter benefits and their implicit guarantee to sell a lot of mortgages and mortgage-backed securities throughout their lifetime. After all, who wouldn't want to buy a security that was backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government? In this way, they had a huge advantage over other market participants, something that, of course, is anathema to free market ideologues. And this made Fannie and Freddie incredibly profitable companies. Many of those profits, then, were passed along to executives and shareholders in the form of bonuses and other payouts. On top of that, it's true that Fannie and Freddie were brutal, that they used their lobbying efforts, campaign donations, and powerful connections to silence anyone who wanted to have an open and honest conversation and debate about the two GSEs. This, of course, represents the worst of Washington politics. And yet, with all that said, Fannie and Freddie are also kind of indispensable. Let's start with the fact that the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage initially came into existence because of Fannie and has continued to exist because of Fannie and Freddie and the implicit government guarantee. It's easy to be a critic, but it's important to recognize the benefits of our reality. And when the crisis hit in 2008, private credit for mortgages dried up. This left Fannie and Freddie as the sole providers and the only players in the U.S. housing market, the only reason a U.S. housing market didn't completely disappear. This perhaps shouldn't be all that surprising. After all, Fannie and Freddie were created after the Great Depression because private capital completely went away in the mortgage market after the Great Depression. This alone is a somewhat compelling reason to keep them around. Listen to Bethany McLean make these and other arguments as a challenge to the GSE's critics.
But the challenge to that is that actually it's pretty much agreed now that without Fannie and Freddie, especially in times of stress, the mortgage market would shut down and people wouldn't be able to get mortgages. It's also pretty much agreed that without Fannie and Freddie and this feature that has sort of a complicated name, it's called cross-subsidization. And what that essentially means is that the person, the not so well-off person in an undesirable part of the country is paying about the same rate on their mortgage if they're getting it through Fannie and Freddie as the super wealthy person in a high-end part of the country. And the reason is that Fannie and Freddie kind of flatten everything out through their mortgages, so they are providing a benefit. It's a form, you could criticize it and call it a form of redistribution, if you will, but I think it's something that makes American life a little more fair in a time when a lot of things are unfair. Yes. And then let's add one last little layer on top of that, which is Fannie and Freddie's critics always talked about their getting this benefit, this subsidy. But what about the nation's largest banks? They have charters too. Don't they get a subsidy as well? Are their interest rates lower than they otherwise would be because of this idea that the government's going to bail them out? So it's tricky, right?
It is tricky, but also go Bethany. For all their other flaws, Fannie and Freddie are incredibly important and critical companies. It strikes me that ultimately they are probably more Cullens than vampires of folklore. They have provided a critically important social good at times, and when they haven't, well, even the Cullens aren't perfect.
I've killed people before.
But this is so stupid. I'm just trying to think of something. But if you were as dehydrated as I was, you might have as well. That's last time. Last time I'm gonna do something like that. Anyway, that's our show. Thanks a lot for watching, and do make sure you check out our next episode where I'll be talking more about what we should do about Fannie and Freddie and about the investors currently suing the US government over them. Oh, and follow me on Twitter. I always debate whether I want people to do this or not. Follow me on Twitter, Carly P. Riley, Instagram too. I'm also Carly P. Riley there. Anyways, thanks a lot for watching, and I hope you have a great night or day, whatever time it is where you are. Should I stop talking now? All right. That was ad-libbed, in case you couldn't tell.
Which part?
Just pretty much the last 10 minutes.